the chilling shadows of the abandoned orphanage. Nestled deep in the rural countryside of New England, the small town of Wilkes Hollow harbored a dark, unspoken secret. On the outskirts of town, hidden by dense, ancient woods, stood a decrepit, long-abandoned orphanage known as St. Mary's Home for Children. Its looming, Gothic architecture had been left to decay for decades, but the whispers and rumors surrounding the place had never faded. It was said that anyone who entered the orphanage after nightfall never returned the same, if they returned at all. The story that shook Wilkes Hollow to its core, however, was not just another rumor. It was an event that left scars on the town, especially for the young man who would forever carry the weight of what happened within those cold, forsaken walls. Mark and his group of friends had always been thrill seekers. They were the kind of people who got their kicks from the rush of fear, pushing each other to explore the boundaries of their bravery. For years, they had heard about St. Mary's Orphanage, the place no one dared to go. It had been abandoned for over 50 years, and though it was shrouded in mystery, everyone knew the tragic story of how it came to be forgotten. In the early 1900s, St. Mary's was run by the strict and devout Sister Agatha. She was feared more than loved by the children under her care. She ruled the orphanage with an iron fist, and her harsh discipline methods often crossed into cruelty. Children would go missing, and when the local townspeople asked questions, they were told the orphans had been adopted by families far away. But as the disappearances continued, more disturbing rumors began to surface. People started to speak of strange noises coming from the orphanage at night. Screams, cries for help, and eerie laughter. Then, in the winter of 1910, a fire broke out in the orphanage. The blaze engulfed the building, and while most of the children perished, Sister Agatha was never found. Her body was presumed to have been consumed by the flames, but locals speculated that something far darker had happened. After the fire, the building was left abandoned, and no one dared to enter. For years, St. Mary's remained a shadow in the town's history, a place children feared and adults refused to talk about. But for Mark and his friends, the orphanage was the ultimate test of courage. On the night of October 31st, Halloween, they decided they would venture into the haunted ruins. The group Mark, Lisa, Jason, and Kyle armed themselves with flashlights, cell phones, and a healthy dose of bravado. The plan was simple: enter the orphanage at midnight, explore the interior, and capture some footage to prove they had braved the place. They believed they would be out within an hour, laughing off the whole experience. But nothing could have prepared them for the horrors that awaited them. The journey to the orphanage was eerie enough. The dirt road that led to it was flanked by thick, towering trees that blocked out the moonlight. The cold October air bit at their skin, and an unnatural stillness filled the night, as if the world was holding its breath. The group tried to keep their spirits high, joking and teasing each other, but the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on them. When they finally reached the orphanage, the building looked like something out of a nightmare. The crumbling stone walls were draped in ivy, and the windows were shattered, leaving dark, gaping holes where glass once was. The large, iron gates that had once stood at the entrance were rusted and twisted, and the door to the orphanage hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind. "Ready?" Mark asked, trying to mask the unease in his voice. "Let's do this," Jason replied, leading the way. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside. Dust hung in the air, and the stench of decay filled their nostrils. The entry hall was vast, with a grand staircase leading to the second floor. The walls were lined with faded portraits of stern-looking nuns and children with hollow, haunted eyes. "Creepy as hell," Lisa muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. They began to explore, moving from room to room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The orphanage was in a state of disrepair. Broken furniture, crumbled plaster, and mold-covered walls greeted them at every turn. But it wasn't just the decay that unnerved them. There was a strange energy in the place, a feeling that they were being watched. As they ventured deeper into the building, the temperature seemed to drop. The air became thick and heavy, and the silence was oppressive. They tried to shake off the growing sense of dread, but it was clear that something was wrong. Suddenly, Jason's flashlight flickered and went out. He cursed under his breath, smacking it against his palm. "Battery must be dead," he said. Though the doubt in his voice was palpable moments later, Kyle's flashlight did the same, followed by Lisa's. Panic set in as their lights failed one by one, until only Mark's flashlight remained. He shone it on his friends, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," Lisa said, her voice trembling. Mark nodded, but as they turned to head back, they heard it. The faint sound of children's laughter, echoing through the halls. They froze, exchanging terrified glances. The laughter grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be coming from all around them. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. "Run!" Jason shouted, and they bolted for the exit. But the orphanage had other plans. As they sprinted down the hall, the doors they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening crash. Mark tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped in the chaos. They heard a new sound, the slow, deliberate footsteps of someone walking toward them. The air grew colder, and a deep sense of malevolence filled the room. Mark shone his flashlight in the direction of the footsteps, and that's when they saw her, a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a woman, her face obscured by shadows, but there was no mistaking the old-fashioned nun's habit she wore. Her presence exuded pure malice. "Sister Agatha?" Lisa whispered, backing away in terror. The figure began to move toward them, her steps slow but steady. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with his flashlight, trying to keep the beam trained on the approaching figure. Without warning, the light flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The next few moments were a blur of terror. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer, and the air seemed to close in on them. Mark could hear his friends' panicked breathing, their hurried footsteps as they tried to find another way out. Then came the screams. Mark's world collapsed into chaos as his friends were ripped away from him, one by one, their cries echoing in the darkness. He stumbled blindly, disoriented, until he found himself alone in a small, windowless room. The walls were closing in, the temperature freezing, and the sinister presence of Sister Agatha seemed to fill the space. And then, silence. Mark didn't know how long he stayed in that room, huddled in the corner, paralyzed with fear. Hours? Minutes? Felt like an eternity. When the first rays of dawn finally broke through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, he forced himself to move. His limbs were stiff, his body numb, but he had to find his friends. But when he returned to the hallway, there was no sign of Jason, Lisa, or Kyle. The orphanage was silent, the air no longer heavy with malice. It was as if they had never been there. Mark staggered out of the building and into the daylight, his mind reeling. He stumbled into town, disheveled and haunted, unable to explain what had happened. The police searched the orphanage but found no trace of his friends. No bodies, no evidence of foul play, nothing. The town wrote it off as a tragic accident, but Mark knew better. He knew what he had seen, what had taken them. The shadows of St. Mary's still haunted him, and though he tried to move on, the memories of that night refused to fade. The orphanage remained standing, its dark legacy undisturbed, and Mark was left to wonder how many others would fall victim to the chilling shadows of Sister Agatha's wrath.